The shadows of Blackthorn School. Blackthorn Village was a place no one talked about anymore. Buried in the middle of dense woods, it had been abandoned for decades. The stories surrounding it were grim. Disappearances, strange lights in the sky, and, most famously, the tale of Blackthorn School. The school had supposedly been the site of a gruesome event, a fire that consumed the building with teachers and children inside. But when the ashes were sifted, no bodies were ever found. Locals whispered about curses, occult rituals, and a shadowy presence that never left the grounds. When I found out about Blackthorn School during my research for an online urban legend series, I knew I had to go there. My channel needed something fresh, something real, and this sounded perfect. My plan was to visit the village, document the school, and spend the night inside. Alone. I wish I'd never gone. The first sign of trouble came as I approached the village. My GPS lost signal a mile out, the route blinking out like it had never existed. I followed the last road on memory, its cracked asphalt eventually giving way to dirt. The trees pressed in closer, their skeletal branches clawing at the car. When I reached the village, I stopped to take it in. It was like stepping into a forgotten world. The houses were skeletal remains, their roofs caved in and walls barely holding together. The air was heavy, carrying a smell of damp earth and rot. At the center of the village was the school. It loomed like a dark sentinel, its brick walls blackened and crumbling. The windows were shattered, the jagged glass like teeth. My hands shook as I unpacked my gear, camera, flashlight, and a backup battery pack. The school didn't feel abandoned, it felt alive. I forced myself to start filming, narrating as I moved closer. My voice sounded unnatural, too loud in the silence. The infamous Blackthorn School, I said, my breath fogging the cold air. Legend has it that the fire wasn't an accident, but something far darker. Tonight, I'm here to find out the truth. The door creaked open under my touch, revealing a long hallway. The floor was littered with debris, and the smell of smoke lingered faintly, as if the fire had burned just yesterday. I moved carefully, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Classrooms flanked the hallway, their doors hanging open. Inside, desks were overturned, and chalkboards were covered in faded scrawls. Then I saw it. A single desk standing upright in the middle of a room, its surface free of dust. I stepped closer, my camera capturing every detail. Carved into the wood was a name, Eleanor. I shrugged it off as a coincidence. Maybe someone had cleaned up the desk for a prank or an amateur ghost hunter before me. But as I moved deeper into the school, I started noticing other things. A faint whispering, just on the edge of hearing. Footprints in the dust, too small to be mine. And the laughter. It was soft at first, like a child giggling far away. But it grew louder, bouncing off the walls. "Hello!" I called out, the word echoing back at me. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt deafening. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the stories get to me. I found a classroom near the end of the hallway to set up camp. The room was empty save for a few broken desks, but it felt safer. I sat against the wall, camera in hand, narrating my thoughts. So far, nothing supernatural, just an old building with a creepy reputation. But I'll keep filming through the night. I barely got the words out before I heard it. A scraping sound. I swung my flashlight toward the door, heart pounding. Something had moved past the doorway, something small and fast. "Hello!" I called again, but my voice cracked. The scraping came again, louder this time. It sounded like nails on a chalkboard. Against my better judgment, I followed the noise. The hallway was darker than before, my flashlight dimming despite the fresh batteries. The sound led me to a door at the very end of the building, one I hadn't noticed before. It was painted black, the paint peeling to reveal claw marks underneath. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. I pushed the door open, revealing a staircase descending into darkness. The air was colder here, so cold I could see my breath. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. I caught fragments. Help us. Run. Stay. I descended slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. The basement was vast, the walls lined with shelves of rotting books and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. At the center of the room was a large, circular table, its surface stained dark. Symbols were carved into the wood, the same ones I'd seen scratched into the walls upstairs. And then I saw her, a little girl standing on the far side of the room. She was dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform, her hair in pigtails. She looked almost solid, but something about her shimmered, like heat rising off asphalt. "Are you Eleanor?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. I stepped closer, and she turned to face me. Her eyes were black voids, endless and empty. She opened her mouth, and the whispers filled the room, so loud they made my ears ring. "Leave," she said, her voice layered with countless others. "Or join us." The room began to shake. Shelves toppled, jars shattering and spilling their contents. The symbols on the table glowed faintly, pulsating with a sickly light. I ran. The staircase seemed to stretch endlessly, the whispers chasing me, growing louder and more desperate. When I finally reached the main floor, the school had changed. The walls were no longer crumbling but pristine, the air thick with smoke and the sound of children screaming. Flames licked at the edges of the hallway, consuming the walls but never touching me. Shadows moved within the fire, teachers and students, their faces twisted in agony. At the end of the hallway stood Eleanor, her black eyes fixed on me. "You shouldn't have come," she said. I burst through the front doors, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. When I turned back, the school was gone. In its place was an overgrown field, silent and empty. I drove all night, not stopping until I was miles away. I tried to forget what happened, but the nightmares won't let me. I hear the whispers when I'm alone, see Eleanor's hollow eyes every time I close mine. And sometimes, when the night is quiet, I smell smoke. The Forgotten Schoolhouse started with a dare. My cousin Mark and I had grown up hearing about the old schoolhouse on the outskirts of Ravencroft Village. Everyone in the nearby towns knew the stories, how it had been abandoned overnight, the children and teachers vanishing without explanation. Locals whispered about the screams heard in the dead of night and shadows moving behind the shattered windows. Mark, ever the thrill-seeker, thought it would be the perfect place to spend the night. "We'll bring some gear, stay until sunrise, and prove everyone wrong," he said with a grin. I wasn't as convinced. I'd heard enough from the locals to know Ravencroft was no ordinary village. People avoided it like the plague, and those who ventured too close rarely came back the same. But Mark had a way of twisting my arm, and before I knew it, we were loading up his old Jeep with flashlights, cameras, and sleeping bags. We arrived at the village just as the sun was setting. It was smaller than I'd imagined, more a scattering of crumbling cottages and overgrown paths than a proper settlement. The schoolhouse loomed at the edge, its dark silhouette cutting against the fiery sky. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the gravel road. As we approached, the building seemed to grow taller, its broken windows like empty eyes staring down at us. Mark shoved the creaking door open with a laugh. "See? Just an old building. Nothing to be afraid of." But as I stepped inside, a shiver ran down my spine. The air was damp and cold, carrying a faint metallic tang. The walls were covered in faded murals, scenes of children playing and learning, their painted smiles eerie in the dim light. The plan was simple: explore the building, set up camp in one of the classrooms, and document the night. Mark was buzzing with excitement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The first few hours passed uneventfully. We wandered through the empty hallways, filming graffiti-covered walls and overturned desks. Most of the classrooms were in various stages of decay, their floors warped and ceilings caving in. But one room stood out. At the end of the main corridor was a door, its surface unnaturally clean, as if it had been freshly painted. Mark pushed it open, revealing a perfectly preserved classroom. desks were neatly arranged, the chalkboard unmarked, and a faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. "Guess the ghost janitor's been busy," Mark joked, but his voice sounded strained. We decided to set up camp in that room, despite my protests. Something about it felt off. The air was too still, too quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath. As the night wore on, the sense of unease grew. The wind outside picked up, howling through the broken windows like a mournful wail. Our flashlights flickered sporadically, and the temperature seemed to drop with every passing hour. At midnight, the first sound came, a faint scratching, like nails on wood. "Probably a rat," Mark said, though his grip on the flashlight tightened. The scratching grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to echo from the walls. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Angry, accusing. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mark nodded, his bravado slipping. We decided to investigate, though every instinct screamed at me to stay put. The hallways were darker now, our flashlights barely cutting through the shadows. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more insistent. When we reached the far end of the hallway, we found the source of the scratching. A door, its surface marred by deep gouges. "Should we open it?" Mark asked, though his voice wavered. I shook my head, but he was already reaching for the handle. The door swung open with a creak, revealing a staircase spiraling downward. The air that wafted up was damp and foul, carrying a faint coppery tang. "Basement," Mark muttered, his curiosity outweighing his fear. Reluctantly, I followed him down. The basement was worse than I could have imagined. The walls were lined with old, rusted lockers, their doors hanging ajar. Chains dangled from the ceiling, their purpose horrifyingly clear. At the center of the room was a circle etched into the floor, its grooves filled with a dark, dried substance. Symbols I couldn't recognize surrounded it, their shapes twisting and writhing as if alive. Mark crouched to get a closer look, his flashlight casting long shadows across the room. This is messed up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's when the door slammed shut. We spun around, but the staircase was gone. In its place was a solid wall, the bricks old and crumbling. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the cacophony. The shadows in the room deepened, pooling in the corners and creeping toward us. I grabbed Mark's arm, my nails digging into his skin. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. But there was no way out. The whispers turned into screams, high-pitched and agonized, echoing off the walls. The chains began to swing violently, clanging together in a maddening rhythm. And then we saw them. Figures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering like static. Children, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes black pits. They moved closer, their hands outstretched, mouths opening in silent wails. Mark stumbled back, tripping over the circle. The moment his hand touched it, the room seemed to convulse. The figures froze, their heads snapping toward him in unison. "You shouldn't have come," one of them hissed, its voice like nails on glass. The floor beneath the circle cracked, revealing a chasm of writhing darkness. Mark screamed as tendrils of shadow shot out, wrapping around his legs and pulling him toward the abyss. I grabbed his arms, trying to pull him back, but the tendrils were too strong. "Run," he shouted, his voice desperate. But I couldn't leave him. The figures closed in, their hollow eyes burning into mine. One of them leaned close, its breath icy against my skin. "Leave," it whispered, "or join him." I didn't have a choice. I let go of Mark's arms and ran, the sound of his screams echoing in my ears. The hallway reappeared before me, stretching endlessly as I fled. When I finally burst through the front door, the sun was rising, bathing the village in pale light. I turned back, expecting to see the schoolhouse, but it was gone. In its place was an empty field, overgrown with weeds. Mark was never found. The police dismissed my story as hysteria, chalking his disappearance up to an accident. But I know the truth. The village still calls to me sometimes, in dreams and whispers. And I know one thing for certain. The schoolhouse isn't gone. It's waiting. The Whispering Walls. I didn't want to go to Blackwood Village. It was one of those places that people whispered about but rarely mentioned by name. The kind of town that vanished from maps as if the world itself wanted to forget it ever existed. But my curiosity often got the better of me, and as an aspiring documentarian of the eerie and unexplained, this was the type of story I couldn't resist. The centerpiece of Blackwood's dark history was its school, a crumbling building tucked away in the forest at the edge of the village. The stories claimed it had been abandoned for decades after a tragedy no one wanted to discuss. Children disappeared there, teachers too. Parents swore they'd heard whispers echoing in the hallways long after the school was emptied. It was the whispers that drew me in. The road to Blackwood was rough and narrow, the forest crowding in on either side. By the time I reached the village, the sun had sunk low, casting long shadows over the few decrepit buildings that remained. The school stood on a hill just beyond the village, its silhouette jagged against the orange sky. I parked my car at the edge of the forest and hiked the rest of the way, my camera bag slung over my shoulder. The air grew colder as I approached the building. The trees here seemed taller, their branches twisting unnaturally. The school itself was worse than I'd imagined. The roof had partially caved in, and vines snaked up the brick walls like veins. The windows were shattered, their jagged edges glinting in the fading light. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under my boots, their groans echoing through the empty hallways. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. The first room I entered was a classroom. Desks were overturned, their legs bent and broken. A chalkboard at the front still bore faint scribbles, though I couldn't make out the words. A forgotten shoe sat in the corner, its laces frayed and dusty. I set up my camera and began filming, narrating my findings. "This is the heart of the Blackwood mystery," I said, "where children vanished," and the walls began to whisper. As if in response, I heard it. A faint sound, like the rustling of leaves, but softer, almost a sigh, came from the hallway. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. No answer. I told myself it was just the wind, though the still air begged to differ. I continued down the hallway, my steps cautious. The sound followed me, always just at the edge of hearing. The second classroom was worse. The walls were covered in writing, scratched into the paint with something sharp. Words overlapped, forming a chaotic tapestry of phrases. "Stay quiet. Don't trust them. They're still here." At the center of the room was a single desk, untouched amidst the chaos. On it lay a notebook, its cover faded and torn. I flipped it open, the pages brittle under my fingers. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in haste. "They come at night. They don't let you leave. Don't listen to the whispers." The last line was smeared, but I could just make out the words. "The walls remember." A loud bang startled me, and I dropped the notebook. The sound had come from somewhere down the hall. Heart pounding, I picked up my flashlight and moved toward it. The hallway stretched endlessly now, far longer than it had been when I first entered. Doors lined both sides, their dark interiors gaping like mouths. The banging came again, louder this time, from a door at the end of the hall. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave and never return. But the pull of the unknown was stronger. I reached the door and pushed it open. It was the gymnasium, though it barely resembled one anymore. The bleachers were collapsed, and the floor was warped and splintered. At the center of the room stood a single figure. It was small, childlike, but wrong. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its limbs seemed too long, too thin. Stood motionless, its back to me. "Hello," I whispered. The figure twitched, its head snapping toward me. Though its face was obscured by shadow, I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing. It opened its mouth, and the whispers began again, louder now, surrounding me. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. The figure didn't move, but the whispers grew, overlapping and echoing until they became a deafening roar. "Stop!" I shouted, clamping my hands over my ears. The whispers ceased. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I ran. The hallway twisted and turned, the walls seeming to close in around me. Doors slammed shut as I passed, their echoes ringing in my ears. My flashlight dimmed further, the beam barely cutting through the thick darkness. I reached the main entrance, but the door was gone. In its place was a solid wall, its surface cracked and bleeding shadows. "No, no, no!" I cried, pounding on the wall. Behind me, the whispers started again, soft and mocking. I turned to see the children, dozens of them, their forms faint and flickering like static on an old TV. Their faces were pale and featureless, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. They moved closer, their small hands reaching out for me. "Please," I begged, though I didn't know what I was asking for. The shadows deepened, swallowing the children one by one until only darkness remained. And then I heard it. A voice, clear and cold, cutting through the whispers. "The walls remember." When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the forest, the school nowhere in sight. My camera was gone, and my clothes were damp with dew. I stumbled back to my car, desperate to leave. But as I opened the door, I froze. The notebook from the classroom sat on the passenger seat, its pages fluttering in the wind. And on the first page, scrawled in fresh ink, were the words, "They let you go. This time." The Silent School of Black Hollow. I wasn't supposed to be here. That thought pulsed in my mind as I stared at the imposing gates of Black Hollow Village School, their rusted iron bars tangled with vines. The building beyond them was dark and silent, its windows like hollow, watchful eyes. "Just get the photos and leave," I muttered to myself. As a freelance journalist, I was always chasing unusual stories, and Black Hollow was one of the strangest. The village had been abandoned nearly 2 decades ago after a series of mysterious disappearances, all centered around the school. Locals whispered about cursed grounds, but I didn't believe in curses. It was supposed to be a quick assignment. Visit the school, snap a few eerie photos, and write a sensational story for the magazine. Easy. But as I pushed open the gates, their hinges groaning like a wounded animal, I felt the weight of the silence settle over me like a shroud. The main building was worse up close. Its brick walls were cracked and streaked with moss, and the faint smell of rot hung in the air. I stepped inside cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The hallway stretched out before me, lined with rows of lockers. Many were ajar, their doors hanging limply like broken jaws. Faded posters clung to the walls, their cheery slogans about learning and growth mocking the oppressive atmosphere. I moved deeper into the school, the sound of my boots echoing against the cracked tiles. The air was heavy, thick with the weight of something unspoken. I found the first classroom on the left and pushed the door open. Desks were scattered across the room as if abandoned in a hurry. A blackboard at the front still bore the faint chalk outline of a lesson, History of the Village, 1889-. The rest of the date had been smudged away. I raised my camera and took a few shots. The flash momentarily lit up the room, casting stark shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. That's when I heard it. A faint giggle. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was high-pitched, unmistakably childlike, and it came from the hallway. "Hello!" I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. I stepped back into the hallway, shining my flashlight in both directions. It revealed nothing but the same eerie stillness. "Just your imagination," I told myself, though I didn't believe it. I continued down the corridor, stopping at another classroom. This one was different. The desks were arranged neatly, as if still waiting for students. A single notebook sat open on the teacher's desk at the front. Curious, I approached it, my flashlight illuminating the page. The writing was faint and smudged, but I could make out a single phrase repeated over and over. "Do not stay after dark." A chill ran down my spine. I snapped a photo of the notebook and quickly backed out of the room. Something felt wrong. The air was colder now, and the shadows seemed to deepen, as if the school itself were alive and watching me. As I turned to leave, I noticed a faint light flickering at the end of the hallway. It wasn't there before. It looked like the soft glow of a candle. "Is someone else here?" I whispered. I hesitated, then moved toward the light. My footsteps sounded deafeningly loud in the oppressive silence. The glow led me to a staircase descending into the basement. The air was damp and carried a faint metallic tang, like rust or blood. The logical part of me screamed to leave, but curiosity overrode it. If there was someone down there, I needed to know. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the candlelight growing brighter with each step. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in crude drawings, etched into the plaster with what looked like fingernails. Stick figures danced and twisted in grotesque shapes, their hollow eyes staring back at me. In the center of the room stood a small wooden desk. On it was an old-fashioned oil lamp, its flame flickering weakly. Beside the lamp lay a doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained. And then I noticed the footprints. Tiny, muddy footprints led away from the desk and into the darkness beyond the room. They didn't look old. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice trembling. No response. I followed the footprints, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The path led me to another door, this one slightly ajar. Pushed it open. The room beyond was a makeshift classroom, much smaller than the ones upstairs. Child-sized desks were arranged in neat rows, and at the front stood a blackboard covered in incomprehensible scribbles. But what caught my attention were the figures. They sat at the desks, unmoving. Dozens of dolls, each one dressed in tattered clothes, their glassy eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized the dolls weren't arranged haphazardly. They were positioned as if attending a lesson, their faces all turned toward the blackboard. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the shadows around the dolls seemed to shift. That's when I heard the giggle again, louder this time. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room. It landed on a figure standing in the doorway. It was a child, or at least it looked like one. Their face was obscured by the shadows, but their small frame was unmistakable. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, the gesture unnervingly slow. "I can help you," I said, stepping closer. The child giggled again, but this time it was wrong. Distorted like a record played backward. The sound grated against my nerves, and I stumbled back. As I did, the dolls in the room began to move. Their heads turned in unison, their unblinking eyes now fixed on me. I bolted. I ran back up the stairs, my flashlight bouncing wildly. The hallway upstairs was different now. Longer, darker, and lined with doors that hadn't been there before. The whispers started then, faint and overlapping, like 100 voices murmuring secrets just out of reach. I ran blindly, the walls seeming to close in around me. My heart pounded as I reached the main entrance, but the doors were gone. In their place was a solid wall. "No, no, no!" I shouted, slamming my fists against the bricks. The whispers grew louder, rising to a deafening cacophony. I turned, pressing my back against the wall, and saw them. Figures, children, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows. Their faces were pale and featureless, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved closer, their tiny hands reaching out for me. And then the giggle came again, right behind me. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the porcelain face of the cracked doll, its lifeless eyes staring into mine. When I woke up, it was morning. I was lying in the middle of the road, my car parked a few feet away. The school was nowhere in sight, as if it had never existed. But when I opened my car door, I froze. The doll was sitting in the passenger seat, its cracked face turned toward me. In its lap was the notebook from the classroom, open to a single page. Scrawled in red were the words, "Don't come back,